Does it work? Sure. Director, their committee, and to all of you who found the time to show up and attend this trial lecture. I'm happy, mostly happy, grateful and humble to having been allowed to stand before you and present my research. And I was given the following assignment. What are the theoretical and practical implications of your thesis for various stakeholders? And while it might sound straightforward, it provided an adequate challenge because it is an assignment that can be handled in different ways. So in order to approach this, I've chosen to frame this trial lecture within one of the conceptualizations derived from my research, namely that of the orchestration of talent development. And I've used the metaphor of orchestration to better capture how one can conceptualize the facilitation of developmental processes for the individual athlete within Norwegian handball. And from this onset, I'll turn to discuss the theoretical and practical implications for various stakeholders, and I'll use the 30 next minutes or so to do that. So the outline of my presentation will be that I will start by presenting some of the key findings from the talent development model of Norwegian handball. I then turn to discuss some of the concept of coach orchestration and how it applies to talent development, or can be applied to talent development. I'll turn to the theoretical implications of my study findings, and I'll finish up by recommending some of its practical implications for the various stakeholders. So if we turn to what we can call the talent development model of Norwegian handball, which is actually the STU, or in Norwegian lapskaus, of club-based practice and competition, of sports school programs, of regional level talent development initiatives, and of youth national team settings, it is a complex, dynamic, and unpredictable system. And it is what we can call a loosely coupled system. And what I did was to study how the talent development model of Norwegian handball shape and influence youth national team athletes' experiences and development at the individual level. And I'll present the study in detail later today, so just for now, please just buy into the findings I present and come back hopefully at 1 o'clock, and you can hear some more. So if we turn to the characteristics of the talent development model, there is no clear distinction between talented and non-talented athletes, and all athletes, skilled or less skilled, they practice and compete within the same structure. Athletes continuously move between these different levels and team settings, whereas no actor has sole responsibility for talent development, nor do they have any instructional authority over another. And together this creates what we can describe as a hierarchical and multi-centric organization, where each organizational unit act based on their own interests and aims, where most activities are both and not instead of, meaning that a young athlete simultaneously practice and compete in different team settings. They relate to different players and coaches. They compete for selections and playing time all over the organizational landscape. And the different practice and competition settings, they vary in quality. And uncertainty and unpredictability becomes an inherent part of the system. And importantly, my point is not that this is neither a good nor bad model. Rather, the point is that its unique features both enable and constrain development and in certain different ways, and has both intended and unintended consequences. Personally, I think this model has a lot to it and is interesting in several different ways, and in many ways are good for athletes, but it has some consequences. Because when it works, the model creates complementary influences that facilitate various pathways to the adult elite level. And possibly, it makes more room for more players and more different players for a longer period of time. So just to illustrate this, I'll use some examples from some of the players I coach in Oppsal håndball. I know some of them are here today. Martha, er du her? Ja, Martha er her. Martha, she was selected to the national team quite late, and she played only one international championship. But she has national team experience from the youth level. She attended a really good sport program, but she was released from her contract with her elite club and played a full season at the second national level before returning to the elite level, where she now has established herself as a key player for Oppsal håndball. And then we have Maria. She's not here, but she's probably been selected to all youth national team activities there ever was. She also attended a really good sports school program, and she made a successful transition to the adult elite level quite early, at the age of 17. And she's been a key player at the adult elite level for years, and she's become, and she's now that good, so she's now on her way to play professional handball in Denmark. And the Danish league is still a step up from the Norwegian league. And then we have Juna. Juna's never been selected to anything. And she went to a good, but not the best sports school, I think. She was a bench player for years before establishing herself as the preferred choice and thus also becoming a key player just the previous season. But Juna has become so good, so Juna has also been offered a contract in Denmark and is on her way to play professional handball there. But when it doesn't work, the model is frequently experienced as exhausting. The risk of injuries increase, and this means possibly that who makes it to the adult elite level and who don't become more reliant on coincidences. And you can also see that I've colored the boxes to kind of try and highlight the strengths of my findings, and I'll get back to that when I hopefully present my thesis later this afternoon. So how does practitioners attempt to optimize talent development within this model? Well, most often, most attempts focus on adding more activities aimed at developing athletes. More club practice, more days spent at trainings, camps, more youth national team activities, more tournaments, and so on. And this is especially a pressing concern for those athletes who have been identified as the most talented. And this creates a paradox and is often counterproductive because it results in an increased risk of injuries. Because the real challenge for the talented young handball player is to model through the many activities of youth handball that reaches its height during the years of high school. So this illustration just adds up the different important activities in youth handball throughout adolescence. And as you can see on the illustration, there's a whole lot of stuff going on between the ages of 16 to 19 at both the club, school, regional, and national level. This illustration shows the increase in weekly practice hours during late adolescence, whereas in this period, the talented handball player goes to bed somewhere here at the age of 15 or 16. She wakes up and she almost doubles her training load overnight. The talented handball player plays matches for 3 to 4 teams at the same time. And the most talented handball players has a 4 to 5 year long season that never ends. Because in what should be the off-season period, the youth national team organizes most of their activities. But if the player, for different reasons, and with sufficient luck, managed to muddle through the critical years from 16 to 19, she'll find herself in pole position for a successful transition to the elite level. And this is because she's been exposed to so much high-quality practice and competition, so that she most likely will have gotten quite good at playing handball. there it is. So going back to orchestration. The method for orchestration has been suggested as a useful way of conceptualizing the dynamic processes involved in leadership in complex settings, whereas uncertainty is an inherent part. And in such, orchestration becomes a way of thinking about leadership. And within sports coaching, the coach as orchestrator referred to how sports coaching involves steering rather than controlling, how detailed planning and coordination functions are crucially characterized by flexibility and through incremental planning, how coaches' actions can be described as stage managing events involving continuous decision-making related to iterative planning, observation, and reactions to contextual goings-on. And orchestration then presupposes that coaches cannot directly control the result or outcome, but has to influence the preconditions by working through social relations. That coaches exercise variable but always limited control over other actors, such as players, assistant coaches, and other team members, and that they have limited awareness of the other actors involved within and outside of one's own team setting, and that they operate in context, whereas the actors involved hold contradictory beliefs and pursue diverse objectives. Moreover, orchestration turns our attention to the dilemmas and paradoxes inherent in sports coaching. And these dilemmas and paradoxes, they cannot be solved once and for all. Instead, they need to be continuously balanced. So as a coach, how do you balance collective versus individual needs? Do you praise teamwork or do you reward individual performances? How do you balance short-term versus long-term perspectives? Do you aim to develop creativity or effectiveness? And how do you negotiate the continuous selections going from a full squad to the team who plays the match and to the ones that are at the court or at the pitch or whatever at the same time, those who plays? And it's not either or, it's both and it just needs to be balanced in some kind of way. So when we pair up orchestration and talent development, orchestrating talent development becomes a perspective of leadership focused on how one can facilitate and sustain athlete development within such or such a model or a similar model to that of Norwegian handball. And I have in the thesis and in the second paper argued that the concept of coach orchestration can be expanded to encompass what coaches must consider in order to facilitate individual development, not only within, but also across different team settings. And I think that the context of athlete development in the Scandinavian sports model amplify these ambiguities and dilemmas that orchestration turns our attention to. And what seems the most challenging exercise for all stakeholders involved in the athlete development model in Norwegian handball is to reflect upon the long-term consequences of my actions here and now across and beyond individual team settings. And orchestration, thus, it becomes a perspective on leadership for facilitating and optimizing the development of talented athletes within such a model. And if we turn to its theoretical implications then, I will argue that, and I'll do that later today as well, that contemporary models of athlete development, they're not based on organizational structures that are similar to that of Norwegian handball. And to study this from an empirical and organizational perspective may lead to other novel approaches to understanding talent development or athlete development. And orchestration leadership is a form of leadership which is particularly well suited to organizations that are multi-centered. And importantly, I see orchestration as what Herbert Blumer would call a sensitizing concept. And a sensitizing concept enables us to engage in thinking. And Blumer writes about sensitizing concepts as opposed to definitive concepts, and says that whereas definitive concepts provide descriptions of what to see, sensitizing concepts merely suggest directions along which to look. And moreover, Blumer thinks that concepts like culture, institutions, social structures, organizations that they're not definitive concepts, but that they are sensitizing in nature. And leading from that, orchestration may provide us with a conceptual tool that focuses our attention and assist our analysis and engagement in processes of athlete development. And this kind of theorizing, according to Chalmers, can move beyond individual situations and immediate interactions to include collectivities, institutions, alter our viewpoint, and change our consciousness. So the way we think and the way we view the world may determine or influence the ways we act as coaches, as leaders, as athletes, or practitioners within this model. And I do believe that the findings of my study support that coaching and athlete development can be viewed as nonlinear and emergent, meaning that there's no clear dose-response relationship between single variables and the facilitation of athlete development within this model. And here the outcome goes beyond the pure sum of the contributions of each individual team setting. And that instrumental strategies to development, they're clearly important, but it is also necessary to understand that there's not always, or beforehand, or in advance, a clear what is the rational or best solution to the challenges faced by the individual athlete. It's hard to plan in advance. And I think that both coaching and athlete development is relational and social, meaning that it is important to get a hold of the athlete's subjective experience in order to create a better foundation for my decision making as a practitioner. So within this context, successful athlete development depends on flexible approaches and mutual adaptations to decisions made in other team settings than my own. And I think that this can be enabled through a continuous effort to notice what is going on and how this changes. So going all zen here, Anders Melland. Through noticing, emphasis is placed on looking beyond the immediate to a close analysis of the seemingly ordinary expression of everyday life. Meaning that traditional planning appears to complement but not replace noticing, flexibility, and mutual adaptation as strategies vital for successful athlete development. Because when one decision is made here, it might alter or influence my preferred strategy or what would be the best solution here, and so on. It goes back and forth. And while I am aware that orchestration has been criticized for being difficult to operationalize, teach, and practice, I do think that orchestration can be taught in coach education programs and in order to raise coaches' awareness. But I'm sure that was something we can discuss later today. And as Abrams and Professor Collins has suggested, I think that a proper skill set can be developed through reflective practice and through training in what they term both classical and naturalistic decision making. And I think this reflective process is what makes orchestration a concept that we also can act upon. So just to put it simply and wrap this up, orchestrating talent development directs coaches' attention towards the dynamic context, the changing needs of athletes, and their subjective experience. And it may lead us to develop the ability to carefully notice social processes within and beyond our own team setting through reflective practice, making us better at implementing more flexibility in our everyday coaching practice, and by letting us becoming more adaptive to decisions made in other settings. But how does this translate into practical implications for the various stakeholders in Norwegian handball? Well, in order to contextualize these stakeholders, we can do so at the organizational level or at the individual level. And at the organizational level, we find the clubs, the sports schools, the regional level talent development initiatives, and the youth national teams. And at the individual level, we find athletes, coaches, sport administrators, parents, sponsors, agents, politicians, and maybe even a whole bunch of other stakeholders. But for the purpose of this talk, I'll continue to focus on the organizational actors, and especially the coaches and sport administrators that are embedded within these. So based on the empirical results of my study, I would argue that we can draw some inferences, and some of them would be something like this, that athletes would benefit if club coaches were to sometimes compromise team-based needs in order to facilitate sustainable long-term development for the individual. That club coaches were to understand that the optimal planning and training for a youth national team athlete is something entirely different than for those players that has not been selected to youth national team activities. It's a whole different ballgame to have a player in your team which is involved in youth national team activities than a player that's not. It's different coaching Marta and June during that period of time in their development. I believe that athletes would benefit if club coaches could balance a safe environment by letting you play with your peers, for example, and adequate challenges by playing upwards, for example. And that such decisions should be made together with the athlete. Because their subjective experience, it's important to capture this at this point. Because both are really important. And having a safe and secure environment and stretching, both having a safe and secure environment and stretching one's abilities to the limit. But we need to balance those two concerns. And that competitive match activities should be either or, and not both and, in order to balance the risk-reward relationship between match exposure and injuries. And I think that the sports school programs can best be understood as an important but complementary influence to the other activities, and that athletes would benefit if school coaches designed practices that complement the team-focused, club-based activities by, for example, focusing on individual skills training. And the best do. That coaches that work in the school settings never compromised the individual's health or recovery, but instead provided flexible approaches to load management and grading. For example, by letting the individual choose their practice activities, and by having more than a few criteria for grading. And at the regional level, talent development initiatives, athletes would benefit if sport administrators differentiated between who's selected to different activities. For example, that youth national team athletes should be left unselected for regional level development initiatives. It becomes too much. And that regional team coaches focused on designing practices that would inspire and influence athletes' learning and development between selections, because the time spent with athletes at these initiatives is quite limited. At the national level, athletes would benefit if sport administrators and youth national team coaches took the consequences of what is a counterproductive international competition schedule. Because the youth national team championships and tournaments, they're in the middle of the off-season period. And then national team activities could be instead focused not on optimal preparation for competitions, but were instead focused on how they can influence athlete learning and development also here between selections. Because we know that it is a really strong influence for the developing athlete to spend time with the youth national team. So we want to keep that, but we need to balance the risk-reward relationship here as well. That selections would be rotated so that all players got enough rest between selections, international competitions, and seasons. And that the National Handball Federation would focus more resources on ways in which the interplay between the actors involved in talent development could be strengthened and coordinated for the athletes that are the most involved in national team activities. And this can probably be done in several different ways, but it is a pressing concern. And I would say that we know enough now to say that this is an important concern to find a way to handle. And in my opinion, these recommendations will help to maximize the potential impact on a broad population of players, which is important, while at the same time strongly influence but not burn out our most talented athletes. I'm saying talented because we can discuss the concept of talent. Those are those who are identified as talented. So those are the ones that gets the most activity. And Patrick and I can discuss if she's more talented than her, or and so on. But this is the concern. So to summarize, how would be a way to how can we optimize development within such a model? Well, we can do so by emphasizing a stronger focus on coordination of the individual athletes' activities across the organizational landscape. We can do so by understanding that the orchestration of talent development requires coaches not to act as individual agents who exclusively strive to achieve their team's best performance. And it's difficult, but it's maybe what we need to do. And this is the paradox between short-term performance at the team level and long-term development at the individual level within this model. So if we are to wrap it up, I've tried to sell you now for about half an hour how our empirical knowledge of the actual workings of the talent development model of Norwegian handball can be developed into a perspective on leadership that can inform our thinking when we are working with athlete development, and more importantly, have implications for practice. And I agree with Professor Dennison here and Avner in that critical reflection can benefit from challenging prevailing traditions and norms. And I think that has been one of the things I've tried to do with my research. And hereunder problematize our own practices by investigating its unintended consequences, in order to facilitate our undertaking of a greater responsibility and more deliberate decisions. Because, and I'll quote Dennison and Avner again here, that there are many constitutive sanctions taken for granted, invisible, unproblematized, and ignored practices in sport in which coaches place dangerous and developmentally inappropriate demands on athletes. And it's the interrogation of these everyday coaching practices that we believe can benefit athletes' welfare and enhance coaches' effectiveness. And I really believe that after 4 years of research, that the talent development model of Norwegian handball constitutes such a taken for granted practice that was and still is in need of further interrogation, if we are to continue to develop world-class performance and, even more importantly, positive experiences for the young athletes that are involved. So I'm going to leave it with that. So thank you. Thank you for your attention. Big question. I'm going to stop to think while I'm speaking now, but
You're very impressive multitasking and pouring water. I just thought it all over the computer, so you did very well.
No, I think that number one is to raise these concerns. So to be aware of these concerns is really important, because then we have a foundation for discussing these things. And within cultures like Norwegian Handball, well, I'm a coach as well, a lot of these stuff, and that's why I find that article by Professor Dennis and Amner fascinating, is that it becomes, it hinders our awareness. So we get a blind spot for a lot of these concerns. So number one would be to raise these explicitly state these concerns so we can discuss them. I think that we're not discussing the practical implications. We're discussing